Knight anticipated the problems of this panel, the problems this panel has wrestled with, and indeed the conference as a whole when he wrote in 1921, "Economics is a human science. Its foundations are laid in the principles of human conduct, which controls human life. The basis of a science of conduct must be fixed principles of action, enduring and stable motives. It is doubtful, however, whether this is fundamentally the character of human life." Economists look to philosophy and philosophers for guidance on the character of human life and for insights with which they might advance economics as a human science. The four papers in this panel each provide guidance and a set of rich and often brilliant insights and original thoughts that I am humbled, if not intimidated, at the prospect of performing my duties as a discussant. They each offer a unique perspective and make diverse and divergent claims regarding the rather broad subject matter at hand. While this diversity makes for an enjoyable experience for the paper reader and the conference participant, it creates a further challenge for the panel discussant. In my own attempt to rise to that challenge, and in the short amount of time available, I will attempt to critically address what I judge to be the most important arguments in each paper, and then do my best to craft a short integrative comment on the themes they share in common. Finally, I will make a consciously provocative suggestion of an alternative explanation of why both philosophers and economists find what Professor Phelps calls the moral dimension of economics so elusive, and propose a slightly different way forward in the investigation of the relationship between the good life and the good economy. Professor Sennett has preempted my comments to him last night. He presented a paper in the spirit of pragmatism that provides us with a hypothesis, the social triangle, which seeks to explain the informal relationships that define the workplace, and then demonstrate how the disintegration of the social triangle in contemporary investment banks results in a diminution of civility in the workplace. In his observations taken from interviews of back and middle office employees in investment banks, including Lehman Brothers, an institution where I formerly held several senior positions from 1992 to 2002, he identifies short-term time, or a shift in the fundamental focus of the enterprise, from one that serves the interests of clients to one that executes transactions. And he finds this is the principal cause of the dissolution of the social triangle. My first observation, which might be trivial, but it's inspired by Professor Sennett's multiple allusions to Holbein's Ambassadors, one of my favorite paintings in the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. Holbein is also known for some wonderfully detailed triptychs, or three-paneled paintings, which are hinged together. The title of his paper, The Social Triangle, is meant to describe the mutuality of relationships between A, bosses and workers, B, workers amongst themselves, and C, the relationship of workers as a group to the enterprise. But these three relationships are not strictly connecting three vertices with three lines. So invoking my shared admiration for Holbein and perhaps a fastidious Euclidean disposition, I thought the paper on the social relationships Professor Sennett describes might more aptly be described as the social triptych. But there's more than just a trivial suggestion here. The metaphor of the triptych, whose hinges open and close but can also break down, would also open the construct of the internally defined firm to the complexity of external social relationships, including those of suppliers, customers, and competitors that ultimately define any enterprise in important and dynamic ways. Turning to Professor Maffettone's paper, he approvingly cites Phelps and rightly points out that economic justice in the spirit of innovation anticipates the themes of this conference. He goes on to describe human behavior to be often at odds with the economist's definition of homo economicus, another observation made well in the Phelps paper we heard yesterday afternoon, and in Knight's observation cited at the outset of my comments. However, he says he is at odds. Have I lost the mic? However, he states he is at odds with Phelps about the possibility to construe a moral dimension of economics starting with the interpretation of human nature. And his pessimism is due to the necessity of pluralism in any liberal society. In a similar vein to Professor Sidorsky, who I will discuss momentarily, Professor Maffettone asserts that pluralism is a vital prerequisite to liberalism because, quote, there are many interpretations of human nature and we cannot enforce just one of them. There are other contemporary philosophers who contest this claim, including Taylor and Gray, and yet also assert their positions are decidedly liberal. But let's consider these arguments later together with Professor Sidorsky's. I was going to address Professor Maffettone's claims about corporate social responsibility, but since he did not discuss them here, we'll spare you that, with one exception. Professor Maffettone asserts that, quote, it is difficult to reconcile ethical criteria and market efficiency. But difficulty is not always impossibility. As Becker's early work on discrimination demonstrated, markets can account for and even price non-pecuniary motivations. And the more recent work by Kapersik and Hong demonstrated a consistent and persistent excess return premium in the prices of sin stocks that is most convincingly explained by the presence of social norms in market prices. Professor Maffettone sets up a useful dichotomy of subjective and objective values that resonates with Professor Robb's paper from yesterday afternoon. He claims that economists' values are subjective and preferential, and philosophers' values are objective and deontological, which we assume to mean Kantian. He then argues constructively that there is a critical intersection between these two positions and, with less dogma on both sides, progress would be more forthcoming. But he also playfully acknowledges in a footnote that it is a wild generalization to claim that all theories of ethics are objective or Kantian. So I'm very interested in his thoughts on whether the virtue ethics of Aristotle, Thomas, or McIntyre, or the consequentialism of Mill, Hare, and Singer can open a different door to the critical intersection that he describes. Professor Sidorsky presents a truly beautiful and expansive essay, which, while titled The Limits of Philosophy, makes an argument for epistemological modesty on the part of philosophers and economists alike. His juxtaposition of the monism of the economist method and the pluralism that underpins liberal political philosophy is a useful lens that allows him to go on and divide the subject into two distinct clusters of values defined respectively as by freedom, consensual governance, and optimistic economic development on one hand, and equality, growth related to the reduction of poverty, and the concept of sustainability on the other. It is a useful framework with which to investigate the project. But after carefully building out and establishing this framework, Professor Sidorsky reports in resignation that philosophy is limited in providing either a fusion of hierarchy amongst these values or in demonstrating the necessary connections between them. He suggests the same resignation regarding the hypothesis that free markets and the prices they derive are superior to those prices set by monopolies or administered in command economies, and suggests this hypothesis requires empirical confirmation. And likewise, the hypothesis that free markets are superior generators of economic growth more than command economies. If I've captured his argument correctly, the reaction of the empirical economists to these claims and Professor Sidorsky's response to those reactions will be one of the highlights of the open discussion. Professor Helzner's paper contrasts with Professor Sidorsky's paper in a manner that complements them both. It is tight and concentrated, as Professor Sidorsky's is sweeping and expansive, and the style reinforces their arguments. Professor Helzner makes an argument that is rigorous, robust, and precise, and with the caveat that I am not a logician, as best I can tell, he outlines an original interpretation of an optimization framework, which he then applies to rational choice. With this argument established, he goes on, and in the spirit of Peirce's injunction against roadblocks in the path of inquiry, considers Levy's rejection of optimization and asks if conditional judgments of admissibility can also be motivated through an appeal to Peircean pragmatism. His answer to the question is yes, and he cites a passage on the irritation of doubt from Peirce's essay, The Fixation of Belief. My question to Professor Helzner, which I hope he does not dismiss as pedestrian or rhetorical because I'm struggling with it myself, is the following. Does his line of reasoning accommodate Peirce's neglected argument for the reality of God? Or, more pointedly, can the inquiring agent that is the subject of Professor Helzner's paper be likened to the muser in Peirce's neglected argument? And if so, how would Professor Helzner classify the relevance of the muser's decision regarding the reality of God, normatively, prescriptively, or descriptively? I promised to consolidate common arguments in the papers and then propose an alternative explanation in a provocative way forward. The most important common argument is the argument made by Professors Maffettone and Sidorsky, that value pluralism is a prerequisite for liberalism, and if we care about liberalism, we must respect that pluralism, which prevents us from asserting any particular single value in the context of economic science. Both philosophers also prominently employ a Rawlsian construction of liberalism that, while widely accepted and applied, is not necessarily completely settled and uncontested. For his part, Professor Sidorsky has been developing, defending, and refining the conceptual problem of pluralism for more than 50 years, so I'm loath to challenge him directly, as he has certainly heard my argument before and will easily defeat it. Likewise, I'm practical enough to realize that it would be a futile engagement to challenge Professor Maffettone directly in the priority of Rawls' theory of liberalism. Nor does it simply make sense to rehearse the arguments of Taylor or Gray or Kex, since both men have dealt with them already. Thankfully, Professor Maffettone and even Professor Sidorsky have provided me with an alternative, if not pusillanimous, tactic, because they both introduced Hegel. And so it is behind Hegel that I shall hide in advancing my consciously provocational conclusion. In his Science of Logic, Hegel writes, "If it is remarkable when a nation has become indifferent to its constitutional theory, to its national sentiment, to its ethical customs and virtues, it is certainly no less remarkable when a nation loses its metaphysics, when the spirit which contemplates its own pure essence is no longer present in the reality of the life of the nation." Now, one might react to this statement by saying this thing called metaphysics is precisely what Hume and the rest of the empiricists sought to destroy and rub out. And that reaction would be correct, in the particular case of the dogmatic metaphysics of the medieval church, and even in the case of the subjectivism of Descartes. But it is important to remember that the philosophical task of developing a coherent discipline of epistemology, which Hume arguably first advanced, was not necessarily settled the first time around, and even Hume's skepticism remains problematic for many. Because Professor Helzner introduced Peirce into our discussion, I will take the opportunity to recite Peirce's rather accurate and entertaining assessment of Hume's skepticism. What Hume's argument would lead him to is that reasoning is illegitimate because its premises are perfectly satisfactory. He candidly confesses that they are satisfactory to himself. But he seems to be dissatisfied with himself for being so satisfied. It is easy to see, however, that he pats himself on the back and is very well satisfied with himself for being so dissatisfied with being satisfied. Indeed, the arguments that led to our current mainstream epistemology comprise a rich historical tradition. While Hume and Kant alike condemned Cartesian metaphysical tradition that came before them, they disagreed considerably on what represented a different kind of true metaphysics. Kant famously wrote that Hume's attack on Cartesian metaphysics interrupted his dogmatic slumber and inspired the transcendental analytic in the first critique, which he described as his answer to Hume's skepticism regarding causality. But as Henry Allison has recently and meticulously argued in his reading of the first book of Hume's treatise on human nature, through Kantian spectacles, Kant's argument is in large part predicated on Hume's empirical epistemology. Similarly, Hegel observed that Kant's critical philosophy was revolutionary, but also demanding of extension and completion. Like Allison's reading of Allison's argument regarding Hume and Kant, Robert Pippin persuasively argues that Hegel's entire project is indeed a Kantian one. My point is that all these arguments were about metaphysics, which has somehow become lost, if not dismissed as trivial, as a result of what I think is the dominance of positivism in contemporary philosophy. It is the same positivism that dominates contemporary economics and causes, as Professor Schiller noted yesterday, economists to become uncomfortable with the label of worldly philosopher. The positivism to which I refer is the legacy of Comte, whose law of three historical stages, theological, metaphysical, and scientific, assumed that all theological and metaphysical questions were resolved, and that going forward, future questions would be settled in the strict terms of positive science. We can see Comte's positivism in some of the most seminal works of formal economics, Samuelson's Foundations of Economic Analysis, Friedman's The Methodology of Positive Economics, to mention a few. And that these are precisely the formal economics that this conference and the Center for Capitalism Society more generally seeks to challenge in order to develop a more useful human science of economics. Likewise, we can see Comte's positivism in the analytical tradition that defines much of mainstream contemporary philosophy. And yet, Hilary Putnam, one of the most accomplished philosophers identified with the analytical tradition, wrote an essay in 1987 entitled After Metaphysics, What? In which he observed, in every philosopher there is one part that cries, this enterprise of metaphysics is vain, frivolous, crazy, we must say stop. And yet another part that cries, this enterprise of metaphysics is simply reflection at the most general and most abstract level. To put a stop to it would be a crime against reason. And so peering out from behind the grand edifice of Hegel's metaphysical system, I would ask Professors Maffettone and Sidorsky to address some of Hegel's decidedly metaphysical arguments that might allow for a more productive examination of the relationship between the good life and the good economy. For example, Hegel made a pointedly liberal critique of liberalism that eliminated the need for the priority of right over the good. He attempted to accommodate pluralism through mutual recognition in the phenomenology and through Cyclichkeit in the philosophy of right, and placed economic transactions and markets within civil society as opposed to our contemporary vision of markets being outside civil society, where those transactions could manifest themselves as inherently ethical actions that are the prerequisite and building blocks of political organizations. He presented a theory of tragedy that was marked by the internal conflict inherent in some of the most fundamental ethical choices individuals make on a daily basis. And finally, in regard to liberalism, as Paul Franco recently argued, human freedom is the first, last, and in many respects, the only theme in Hegel's political philosophy. In addressing Hegelian metaphysics, I don't expect Professors Maffettone and Sidorsky to fundamentally alter their arguments, but only perhaps merely find an even slightly less pessimistic disposition regarding the philosophical linkage between values and markets, between the good life and the good economy. William Bartley is best known as the posthumanist editor of Hayek's Fatal Conceit, but he was also a student of Karl Popper at LSE, and once described by Popper as his most brilliant and promising student. In 1965, he had delivered a paper entitled The Demarcation of Science and Metaphysics that caused a rift between the two men that lasted over a decade. In it, Bartley argued, Popper has written that the problem of demarcating science from non-science is the central problem in the theory of knowledge. And in his conjectures and refutations, he has described the solution to the problem of demarcation as the key to most fundamental problems of the philosophy of science. I believe that statement, which Popper posited approvingly, characterizes the divide that prevents philosophers from providing guidance to economists and economists from engaging with philosophers on the character of human conduct. But Bartley further argued that, and I quote, once it has been agreed, as has been done by Popper, that not all metaphysical views are illegitimate, that some may be valuable, and that a deductive logical relationship can obtain between some synthetic metaphysical and scientific statements, any attempt at demarcation criteria between metaphysics in this sense and non-metaphysical scientific values loses most of its value as a means of evaluating theories. I suggest to Popper that the problem lies not in the demarcation of the scientific from the non-scientific, but in the demarcation of the rational from the irrational, the critical from the uncritical. Thank you very much.
There is a chance that I will be maybe the first speaker who actually has to do it within his allotted time limit because I have a plane to catch. But you only can benefit from that. Actually, it would be very difficult to be a conventional commenter on these papers because there was a huge diversity here and a lot of, I have actually a lot of small points that I would love to raise, but that I think would not be very productive. So what I want to do is actually to address the certain common theme in certainly some of these papers and also quite a few papers running throughout the conference. And that's this issue of the relationship between economic activity and some kind of moral action. And in particular, I want to actually make one observation that maybe provides a certain kind of perspective from which there's a certain light that can be thrown on this issue. The theme that goes through a number of these papers is some sort of conflict between certain kind of lowbrow egotism of economic activity and a certain kind of imperative of moral action. And the question is precisely, what is the role of economic activity in human life? Not only how can various kinds of economic orders be better or worse for human flourishing, but somehow what is the role of production in Aristotelian terms in somehow the moral life of man, of humans. And actually, I do want to go back to Aristotle for a minute to start, because I think there is a very important thing that Aristotle brought in that actually, the echoes of which you can hear all the time and not always in a with a very good effect. Now, as we all, of course, know, Aristotle divided human life into two areas. The area in which we satisfy our necessity and our necessities. We have needs. We need food, we need to reproduce, and things like that. And that is one area, which is the area of necessity and unfreedom. It happens in the household, oikon, from which the term economics comes. And that's an area of private in the sense of deprived, privation, area that constitutes a precondition of a truly human free life. You have to have those needs satisfied. So production is essentially a lower kind of activity. And after those conditions are satisfied and the slaves produce these necessities of life, the master of the household, can participate in a truly human activity, which he calls praxis. And what are these? Well, pursuit of knowledge is one which realizes human rationality. The other obvious one is pursuit of politics, where in a combination, in relation to his true equals, a person can together debate what is worth doing in life, not what is necessary to do in order to survive, because that a gentleman doesn't have to worry about, but what is really the purpose of life. And in that sense, these discussions about the purpose of life, I think I very rarely think that Ned is wrong, but I think do not include how our economic institutions should be organized. Because the upshot of the Aristotelian view is that economics is about unfreedom, slavery, satisfaction of necessities. It is not about what is really important from a human moral point of view. And there is a tremendous tradition, tremendous inheritance of this view. Not that just because Aristotle had such enormous impact, but it's sort of, it's a very, for all of us who were brought up in sort of European cultures, so much influenced by the culture of aristocracy, this model of life remained. Gentlemen don't work for their living. gentlemen somehow have money, and once they have money, they do things that are worth doing. Art, they write books, they become politicians, they also become soldiers. That's okay. And there are two kinds of descendants of Aristotelian slaves. They're the peasants, who are not really there, and they are the bourgeois, the people who somehow pursue their interests and want to make money and are vulgar because of that, okay? And this system of values, I think, has been tremendously persistent in somehow educated man's or educated person's view of economics. And I think it's very important to look at the other part of our sort of intellectual history, where, from which change and a very serious revision of this view, of this worldview comes. And so what I want to say now is a couple of words about John Locke, okay? Locke said, we live in this, he started from the point of view, we live in this world that is essentially governed by natural laws, is independent of us, is alien to us, is potentially threatening to us, and so on. And through our activity, through our labor, we appropriate that. Now that is very consciously anti-Aristotelian. Labor turns out not to be just something where you satisfy your necessities. Labor is something that tames the world, makes it ours. That's what the meaning of property is. It's not just a legal state. It's a natural phenomenon where we appropriate the world, that is, make it in our image. That's what production is. So here he says, no, Aristotle, you were wrong. Production is a crucial activity in which we in which we take things out of this alien order of the natural world and make them into ours, into homes, into places where we feel at home. And so once we create this human, what labor does, it creates this human environment. Once we have created this human environment and we live in it, once we start it, the world with which we interact, again, through economics, which we transform further, the world with which we interact is now, in other words, the world that influences us, in which we are shaped, is not an alien world, but our world. So labor and the transformation of the world around us is what results in a mode of life that is autonomous as opposed to heteronymous. We're no longer simply influenced by external, the world and tabula rasa that somehow becomes just a biography. No, the thing that is so important in labor, it is a process of embodiment of human freedom, that is the capacity, the ability to follow our will and disrupt the natural order of the universe according to our ideas, okay? And as we, so there is literally here a very complex conception of freedom, which places production, in contrast to Aristotle, at the center of human life. That's where we realize, that's why production is not just making of goods. Well, it's making of goods, but not in the sense of cakes and ale, or beer, skittle, or whatever it is, okay? But goods in moral sense, okay? Because it is a process of the self-production, sort of what the German called, I don't know, Selbstbildung, or the production of our own life. It's the essence of cultural production. So work is, labor is, this transformation of the world through the production process is what we think of, what we intellectuals and sort of educated people in that aristocratic culture think about art. Art creates a wonderful new world. But Locke says, no, no. That's what's created in the economic process. And only then are this view is married. Actually, it develops in two directions. One is Hegel and Marx take it. Marx wrote Das Kapital, and he thought that was the philosophical treatise of modern times. He thought that was the equivalent of Aristotle's Politics and Hegel's Logic. Namely, economics as a science now traces the real evolution of human nature. It goes to the absolute essence of what human beings are. But of course, he thought of this productive process as so inherently social that it had to be, the economic model, of course, that followed from it is a model of, something of communal governance over economic production and so on. So I don't know, workers' councils, if you want, or something like that. Now, the other way in which this Lockean idea goes is maybe more germane to Locke himself, but people who obviously are very important here is Bentham, Mill, and others, others in some ways more contemporary people, who marry this view with a very strict, very strong individual perspective, namely this kind of sovereignty, individual sovereignty, where the process of production, this crucial process of self-production of human nature, is a process of exchange, consensual exchange among individuals, each of whose values ought to be counted the same way. That is, then this sort of very high, then this theory of production as a quintessentially moral activity of man gets married with a certain kind of view that pluralistic perspective that basically assigns equal value to everybody's individual choices about how they want to lead their lives and how they're going to pursue it through, interact with others through voluntary exchanges. And then, of course, there are all kinds of arguments that actually I think have been somewhat, I was surprised that haven't been mentioned. That is the standard argument of invisible hand, basically, that says that individualism is compatible with the social good after all, precisely because in this kind of market society, the only way in which I can make my goals, pursue my goals effectively is by serving others, by making sure what is it that I can do best that will satisfy them, and only then will I be able to satisfy myself. So it's not from the benevolence of the butcher that we get the meat. It is from his self-interest. So we have now an elaborate theory, and of course you can go too far. I don't want to, but we have an elaborate theory in which you start from something like Aristotle's Politics, and you end up with somehow a capitalist version of Das Kapital, that is a moral theory of production, which is rooted in a certain theory of how moral interests of various individuals engaged in this process of self-realization interact with one another on a voluntary basis, and therefore in a way which harmonizes their interests rather than puts them at war with each other. So I think that in that sense, I think I'm sure I haven't said anything that novel here, but what I think is there is a certain neglect of this very long tradition of seeing our productive ability as not that kind of lower level activity that essentially we have to free ourselves from in order to truly be moral human beings, but precisely as an elaborate view that sees in that activity the main source of human self-realization. So I think that that is sort of a little bit on the margin of these papers, but I think it actually does meet them at some point. Thank you.
In response to the question of pluralism, Berlin does not succeed, and I've written on this. Berlin does not succeed in showing pluralism without relativism. He does show pluralism as viable in the cases where you don't have questions of cognitive value. So if we have to choose between Homer, who represents one way of life, one set of values, and Dante, who represents a different great poem set of values, and Shakespeare, who represents a third one, he is right to say you can't rank them, you can't present a hierarchy. In some ways, he even says, he withdrew under Momigliani, they're incommensurable, they're plural. But if you say Nazism or some other cruel system, or a democracy or some humanitarian system, you can't say these are plural values and fascism is a matter of taste, to quote Molotov. That was, and he doesn't resolve the question of how that degree of pluralism avoids relativism. And the positivists, of course, don't avoid. They become non-cognitivist here. Whereas I am a cognitivist and an objectivist, and what I said was, these provide reasons for a decision. And when you give reasons, the reasons are either good or bad, meaning by that usually the degree of relevance and the degree of truth. So if you say democracy is justified over Nazism or free markets are justified over monopolistic price setting, you have to give the reasons, and the reasons presumably are relevant to human welfare, human needs, and of course those themselves are questioned later, and the reasons have to be true as opposed to false. So I do think ethics can be objective and cognitive, in that sense not a positivist and not a pluralist in the sense in which pluralism cannot avoid relativism. So I think your point is very well taken. I do not think Rawls achieves this because I think Rawls's egalitarianism, although he leaves it open enough on application, is not pluralist enough in terms of his insistence on a degree of equality, which I think is not, he does not provide the reasons which would justify it. The dilemma of the right and the good goes different ways depending on contexts. But the point is well taken on terms of that I do not wish to be classified as a positivist in terms of ethics, and that the pluralism is inadequate, and you want cognitivist reasons for ethics. Now, regarding economics, I'm not sure. I think to some degree the ideal of every science, and to the degree to which economics aspires to be a science, ought it to aspire to be a science? Yes. I think it is positivist. Relationship of where the values comes in, that your economics must be for good life, has to be some level which doesn't, of course, influence your economics. And I think Professor Phelps certainly agrees with that. His closing comment in terms of the debate with Professor Stieglitz, for example, on public sector versus private sector at the end of the dinner last night. Certainly we're not done to say one morality is superior to another, but we're done in terms of one economic hypothesis is more demonstrable than the other. So I think your point was very well taken against my presentation. I think my position is neither Rawlsian nor positivist. In metaphysics, however, I do not believe in the possibility of metaphysics, so I guess you'd have to say, I don't know whether I'm positivist there, just, what should one say, just feel it hasn't been, it can't be done. You can have great commonplaces, as Dewey said. You can have some other things, but the great vision of having metaphysics, I think, cannot be done. So, in direct response to the questions that were raised, which is why I am responding, pluralism as relativistic, no. Relativism, no, because reasons can be justified as true or false. That is, this reason justifies an ethical position is true or false and relevant. Economics as a science has to some extent be value-free, but where values come in with economics is at some juncture, which is independent of the scientific objectivity. These are platitudes, but as Iberlin did say, platitudes are only worth mentioning when people disagree with them. And some of the platitudes we've stated are open to disagreement, and the position that was formulated against me has great merit. I think Professor Rapaczynski's point is also in part directed correctly. That interpretation of Aristotle as representative of a leisure class and economics as a household is true. Just Professor Nagel's representation of Aristotle is true, but I think there is another tradition in Aristotle, and Aristotle's ethics does allow for that other tradition. And that other tradition has to do with the fact that Aristotle does see humanity as a species. And just as the vegetable soul does nutrition and reproduction, and the sensuous soul fulfills itself in touch, and the visual soul, or the soul of visible species, fulfills itself in sight, and the appetite soul fulfills itself in appetites, the rational being does fulfill itself in moral excellence. That's to say, it achieves great moral virtues, and these are true for all humankind as rational beings, just as it's true for all rhododendrons as vegetable souls, that they can take in food and reproduce, which is not true for minerals, and which is just as it's true for all worms, that they can touch and fulfill excellence in that kind of soul. So all rational souls can fulfill their excellence in moral virtues, and to that extent, the charges against Aristotle as representing that of a slave-owning society and of a leisure class society, well, they are not false, just as it's not false that Isaiah lived in a slave society and so on, and did not live in an egalitarian gender society. Aristotle was, after all, a tutor in the court of, where his father was a doctor, which is the court of Philip of Macedon in the 4th century BC. Nonetheless, the claims for Aristotle on humanitarianism, because the rational soul of all rational beings, which is the human species, whether Egyptian, Ethiopian, Greek, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Greek, or Persian, the rational souls of all human beings can fulfill the moral virtues and show wisdom and courage and justice and politeness and many other virtues. And that is true alongside the other picture. Okay. Yes.
Dr. Kiernan made 3 comments on my paper. All these comments are brilliant and deep. They are of increasing difficulty, and to be serious, to respond to them, you need at least 3 hours. Given that we have 3 minutes, take my response, let's say, as a beginning of an ongoing conversation. The first comment concerns the reconciliation of ethics and efficiency within CSR. I frankly agree here with Dr. Kiernan. I think it's possible. The only thing it's difficult, and I think one of the difficulties is not empirical. There are a lot of empirical difficulties in joining ethics and economics, and at the end of the empirical story, consumers will decide whether it's possible to have a sensible CSR or business ethics in general. But there is also a logical or conceptual, at least, difficulty. This conceptual difficulty, in my opinion, depends on the fact that you have two different, if not opposite, tiers of value at stake. This, I think, it's not irrelevant. It has some significance, of course, to be better explored. The second comment concerned the nature of ethics, and mainly the fact that, of course, ethics is not just deontology. That's for sure. There is utilitarianism, there is virtue ethics, etc. This is an enormous problem. That's why I avoid to discuss it in the paper. It has a lot to do, I think, with the discussion of yesterday between Thomas Nagel and Ned Phelps about two different approaches to the good life. I mean, one is based on the Aristotle-Nietzsche line, interpreted in a vitalistic way or in a perfectionist way, and the other is based on liberalism, contemporary liberalism. I mean, is it possible to reconcile these two approaches? Because there is an evident problem. What I call the Aristotle-Nietzsche line, reinterpreted in a vitalistic or perfectionist way, surely favors creativity, but it's very elitist. It excludes a lot of persons from creativity, like Professor Rapaczynski recently said. I mean, slaves are excluded, women were excluded, and so on. So the problem is how to reconcile it. To put it in a very rough slogan, I would say the way to reconcile it is cultivate Nietzsche at house and practice John Stuart Mill and Rawls in the public sphere. That's, I mean, I know it's very utopian, but it's a way out from a very profound dilemma that we cannot discuss here in 2 minutes. The final question is the impossible one, the one, at least $10 million question. What to think about metaphysics today? And that's, I think we live in a philosophical climate in which there is too much fear on metaphysics. I mean, I think that's a kind of metaphysics that we could call with an Oxford philosopher, Strawson, descriptive metaphysics, which is not only dangerous, but helps a lot to understand our time. It's something in which we are, something we cannot escape from, even if you cannot demonstrate that it exists, to be very moderate. I myself, in a book of mine, distinguish between what I call public metaphysics and separating it from what I call speculative metaphysics. I think that public metaphysics is not only innocent, but helps a lot to understand the public culture in which we are living now. But this is, of course, a very long discourse, I mean, and it's impossible to cultivate it now. I'm sympathetic at the end with Professor Rapaczynski's presentation of the story of the labor through the ages, I mean, and the idea that labor was, so to say, underestimated originally, and in all the aristocratic tradition. And just a very short story. Can I waste 1 second first? Okay, I will give it during the lunch. And
I give you my time. No, go ahead. I give you my time.
I remember in Rome, nearby my house, there is an artisan, which is a very traditional southerner, Italian southerner. And when we arrived there, he used to say, "Oh, your father is a gentleman." First time, second time, third time, fourth time. I began to interrogate myself about why my father was a gentleman, and I was not, evidently, because being the son, I was supposed to be more or less similar to him, and the same family, the same origins, and so on. So I decided, and I asked the gentleman, why, the artisan, why my father is a gentleman? And he said, because he goes out every day at noon. So the tradition, you mentioned, is very popular everywhere in the world. I mean, real gentlemen, real persons of quality, don't work every day, going out 7 o'clock and so on for all day. That I think it's an important consideration. The idea that the good life has something to do with working and with production is a complicated idea, and of course has a lot to do with modernity. By the way, I think that story I mentioned is important to understand why southern Italy doesn't work. That's another problem.
Okay, as the junior member here, I presume, I'll just make a few brief remarks. There was some mention of metaphysics having fallen out of favor in philosophy. I think the tendencies in my own department, this is echoed in the comments of my colleague, David Sidorsky, that maybe metaphysics doesn't meet a very receptive audience in the Department of Philosophy at Columbia. We have a very kind of empiricist, naturalist, pragmatist kind of tradition. But I think that it is probably somewhat well represented in other departments. I personally think that I would allow some place for theoretical terms that don't necessarily have a reduction to empirical content, say in the operationalist kind of tradition. But I would say that you could justify the use of those terms on instrumental grounds. And so rather than trying to pretend that you could assign truth values to those, you talk about accepting or rejecting those terms, and then they play some kind of instrumental role. But that requires that you have some kind of idea of goals that those instruments are in service of. So I'll just mention that, and I'll hand it over to the next one.
It's inevitable that we become confused in dealing, maybe for the first time, with such a hugely complicated subject. But I wonder whether I could clarify my own position, which I undoubtedly didn't succeed in expounding. I didn't really even try to expound it this morning. I was just confining myself to an historical review of prevailing ideas on the good life. But I wanted to say that I fully acknowledge, and I guess I have to emphasize more, that there are lots of ethics out there. I said it in the introduction to the conference, but there was nobody here at that time. There's what I call the materialist ethic, which is that people like to accumulate wealth in order to raise their sustainable levels of consumption and leisure. Some people are more impatient than others, and they stop accumulating wealth sooner than other people. And that, of course, can lead to differences in wealth levels across the population. And some countries, like, say, Italy, have an almost insane desire to accumulate wealth. And other countries, like the United States, are very they don't like to say very much, though somehow the state has managed to provide in social wealth what we lack in private wealth. And then there's the Aristotelian logic, which we've all been talking about a lot. So I think the materialist ethic has been a powerful force behind innovation and behind the transformation of economic life that we've seen since 1830 in several countries. And but at the same time, I think that in the 19th century, the United States benefited tremendously from the ethic of searching for more knowledge, to put it in that stiff way that Aristotle had. We benefited tremendously from the tinkering, the experimenting, the exploring, and all that led to an explosion of productivity, growth, and what we thought was explosion of productivity, and what we thought was sustained growth. Now we have to wonder whether that growth really is going to be sustained. But the second point I want to make is that I think this Aristotelian ethic has now weakened. I think it's in decline. I don't know whether I'll ever find any data going back far enough to establish that. But I have a strong feeling just from direct observation. I spent a lot of time in Europe, as you know, over my career, especially in Italy. And I feel that the Aristotelian ethic that has, to the extent that it was ever strong on the continent, it's weaker now. And it's disappeared. You don't see it. You don't see it in young people in continental Europe. And when I started thinking about these ideas, I was thinking, gee, I hope that doesn't happen here in the United States. And I think that socialism, by accident or by design, I'm not sure which, totally neglected the Aristotelian ethic, neglected this propensity to tinker, to explore, to invent, to experiment. And socialism and corporatism, both European creations, socialism and corporatism both were extremely materialistic. And they never talked about the exhilaration and the fun and the intoxication of discovering a new way to use some tool or a new way to produce something or a new method of farming or whatever. And now you hear, I'm so attuned to this now, I can't turn on the radio without hearing all sorts of remarks, all sorts of views about the economy that clearly exclude any even a glimpse of understanding that people derive their intellectual growth from what they do in the workplace. And if that is gone, they're going to be very unhappy. And you can't get to genuine prosperity by pushing some buttons such as fiscal stimulus. Right. You have to get business investment going, and business investment inspired by innovative ideas. And so let me just see whether, finally, the last comment. In all this discussion I've heard, it's as if countries are all alike. And the stock of the various ethics that we have in all of these countries are all alike. But that's not the case. Yesterday, my new friend Marty had on the screen the Huppert-So work on attempting to measure the degree of flourishing in a bunch of countries. Unfortunately, they stopped at Europe. They didn't cover Canada, United States. But you could see an enormous range even within Europe, from the high flourishers in Denmark and a few other, what were the next two?
Switzerland.
Switzerland. I'm not sure I believe that one, but and I know from my own work using the Ron Engelhardt data from the World Values Survey, I know that there's a tremendous difference between the job satisfaction levels reported by people in the household surveys done for the Michigan World Values Service, a tremendous difference in job satisfaction in Canada and the United States on the one at the one extreme, and Italy and France at the other. And I think that one reason that Sarkozy report on measures of the rewards from work and life, one reason that report never paid any attention to the job satisfaction data is that France is right at the bottom of that. In fact, if you look at 18 countries and you normalize so the top one gets a 1.0 and score and the bottom one gets a 0.0 score, France is there at 0. So I think it's to some extent, we don't have to be talking about those facts and how to think about them all the time. It's wonderful to hear about metaphysics and moral philosophy, but somehow I don't think that those discussions go quite to the essence of the matter, which is not so much my interest is not so much moral philosophy as just trying to, in the case of the United States, trying to get the way we think about economy more in line with our traditional values, which you can show statistically are rewarding. You can show that statistically that countries in which there's a lot of vitalism, as constructed from responses to various questions, where there's a lot of vitalism, there tends to be a relatively high performance. Right. It's not. So yeah, of course I want to see philosophy take more account of this, and I want to see economics take more account of it. But there's also the practical matter of economic policy, and what are we going to do with the tremendous loss of innovative force, loss of, as evidenced by slower growth and everything, that's overtaken so much of the West. We're in a social emergency.